in 3, 2, 1. Good evening, everyone. My name is McKaylee. I work at Tattered Cover Bookstore. And first and foremost, I want to say thank you. Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you for supporting local independent bookstores. We would not be here without you. Not the last year during this global crisis we face together as a human race, and not over the past 50 years as it is Tattered Cover's 50th anniversary this year in 2021. So we say thank you in the best way that we know how, by coming together as a community in a community space, whether that is in person as we are slowly but surely getting there, or our virtual community that we formed over the last year and a half. So thank you so much for that. We're just thrilled to be a part of this community. And from the bottom of my heart, since I've been doing a lot of these events and we're slowly but surely getting into in-person, it's going to be missed for now, but we are here tonight. And I want to say before I go any further that closed captioning is enabled for those who might want it or need it. There's a black bar at the bottom of the screen with a button labeled CC on it. If you click that button, closed captioning is enabled should you want it or need it. And also, for those of you who might not have heard of Tattered Cover Bookstore, we are a local independent bookstore located in Denver, Colorado, with 4 locations, soon to be 5, which is amazing. We have our children's location opening up at Stanley Marketplace in Aurora later this summer, and we're thrilled to be a part of that community as well. Later this year, hopefully our Westminster location is happening. So just keep an eye out for that. The best way to find out more information is by subscribing for our email newsletter or following us on social media. You can still come into our stores and shop around, but as always, we are open 24/7 online at tatteredcover.com. Also at tatteredcover.com is our events, and oh my gosh, do we have events. We have so many up and coming. You can check out all of those, like one this Saturday, Miriam Steinberg, her new graphic memoir called Catalog Baby, about her journeys through miscarriage and infertility. And it's a wonderful, beautiful graphic novel. And you can join us on Saturday, June 5th at 2 o'clock for that. But check out all of our events at tatteredcover.com/event. The one that we have tonight, though, I'm very excited for. Already just in the 10 minutes pre-show, hearing these two talk, I'm just very excited for this, and I know you all are too. We're here tonight celebrating Paula Stone Williams' new book, As a Woman, What I Learned About Power, Sex, and the Patriarchy After I Transitioned. She's going to be in conversation with Jean Hodges. So a little bit about our two guests here very quickly. Jean Hodges is a mother, retired educator, and theater director, community organizer, citizen lobbyist for equality, and advocate for LGBTQ+ inclusion in her Boulder faith community. In 1993, she and her husband helped found the Boulder chapter of PFLAG, which is the oldest national family organization serving LGBTQ individuals and families, with over 200 chapters across the United States. It supports, educates, and advocates for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender equality. She rose through the PFLAG ranks from chapter leader to Colorado State Coordinator to regional director of 5 mountain states. After becoming chair of the Regional Directors Council and vice president of the National Board of Directors, Jean served as the national president and board chair. During her many years on the national board, Jean took a leading role in support, education, and advocacy for the transgender/non-binary community. She was the executive producer of the educational film Faces and Facets of the Transgender Experience. And then our author of the hour tonight, Paula Stone Williams. She's an internationally known speaker on issues of gender equity, LGBTQ advocacy, and religious tolerance. She's been featured in TED Women, TED Summit, TEDx Mile High, the New York Times, Red Table Talk, the Denver Post, the New York Post, New Scientist Magazine, Radio New Zealand, and NPR. Her TED Talks have over 5 million views, and as I mentioned before, we're here celebrating the release of her book, As a Woman. And it's my honor tonight to welcome both Jean and Paula, and I'm going to turn over the camera so we can see the pair of them. Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
It's so good to see you, Michaela. You know, I was thinking about it just now. The very first time I ever came to Denver was the summer of 1991, July. And one of the first things I did was go to the Tattered Cover, because even from New York, where I had lived forever, word gets around that it was a special place to go. I was a regular person attending the Strand in New York, which of course is kind of an iconic bookstore there. And yeah, I was just thinking about that, how much I enjoyed the afternoon that I went over to the Tattered Cover the summer of 1991.
Well, we are happy to take you for an event anytime. Book 2, paperback. We'll be happy to have you. And right now, we're very excited to have you both for this celebration of As a Woman. And I just want to remind our viewers that we are going to be doing a Q&A session after Jean and Paula talk. So keep your comments coming in the chat next to the screen you're watching us on. And that's where you can type in your questions as well. For now, I turn it over to the pair of you.
Well, thank you. I guess I'll start with the interview. I am so pleased also to be here. I consider Paula to be a good friend, and I probably met her when she came to a PFLAG event that we were having, and she told me it was her first time to come as Paula inside a church. And that was 2013, when she had pretty much at that time lost about everything. So I have been part of her story in a sense of just being a friend and offering whatever support I can, but I care deeply about the transgender, the whole LGBTQ, and it's Pride Month, and I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to have us talk about what it means to be transgender through your eyes, Paula. I also hope for our listeners that they will increase their understanding through our interview of what it means to be transgender, so that all of the violence that happens against especially Black trans women will come to a stop. I mean, there's a lot of misunderstanding, which is now having its time across the country in legislation, with people who don't have any idea what they're talking about, in my opinion. So let us begin with your story. The story, your book is divided into 3 parts. I'll just say that for the sake of the audience. And I'm going to be touching on the first 2 parts in particular. And if we have time, 30 minutes isn't very long for all that we could talk about. I will begin with from part 1 is about from birth to your wedding, which is basically your childhood. You're growing up and your secret discontent. You don't choose your family. They are God's gift to you as you are to them, said Desmond Tutu. And I think that's what these questions are about. I understand you were about 4 when you wanted to have the gender fairy.
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, I was somewhere between 3 and 4 years of age. I know that because we moved from that house when I was 4. And the memories are very definitely connected to that house. We did not move to that house until I was 3. So I know it happened during that time frame. That's when I was quite convinced that a gender fairy would arrive. I even knew what she was going to be wearing, this cerulean blue dress, a particular, typical fairy dress, fairy godmother dress. And she would say, well, what's it going to be? And to me, it was that non-dramatic. I would just say, well, of course, that's a girl, because, that's what I am. And I think even that, when you think about it, was actually male entitlement, because, I got pretty much anything else I wanted. So why shouldn't I get to choose my gender? I think about that now, and very definitely, I think was more of a male kind of expectation that I would be able to choose my gender. Started kindergarten, the gender fairy had not yet arrived, and realized, oh, well, that's probably not going to happen. Some of the magical thinking disappeared that comes once you start school. And I did not hate being a boy. I was not one of those people who thought I could not survive as a boy. I just knew I wasn't one. But it wasn't extremely traumatic for me until probably my junior high years.
Mm-hmm. Well, you also grew up in a family that had a long tradition, a religious tradition of pastors. And how did your family affect your own keeping the secret and your own awareness of what you believed was true, and how you dealt with it and how they dealt with it?
That was one of the most painful things to write about in the book, was to realize how much of a bubble that evangelical fundamentalist world is. Back then, no one really knew anything about gender dysphoria, what it's called technically in the DSM-5. Nobody used the term transgender. Occasionally, you'd hear something about someone being transsexual. I remember rushing home from high school, my senior year of high school, because I knew Merv Griffin was going to be interviewing Christine Jorgensen, who at that point was pretty much the only well-known transgender person on earth, as far as I knew. And I just was hoping no one would be at the house, and no one was. And so I was able to watch that, and just how captivated I was by that. There was this sense of, oh my goodness, someone actually did what I would love to do. But it also was terrifying. And it was right at the time that I'd been offered a scholarship to a state university in broadcasting, because I was a disc jockey at a radio station and had been in a contest and won it. And so I had this scholarship offer. But I also had a scholarship offer to a Christian university. My dad was on the board there. My uncle was president. And I was so terrified of being trans that I thought, oh my, I really need to go to that Christian university instead, because it'll be easier to control these urgings. And in fact, for a period of time, it was. For a period of time.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think you thought that once you got married, which of course you had to do, then it would somehow settle things and you'd be able to adjust.
In that fundamentalist world, there is such a focus on purity. In fact, Linda K. Klein's book, Pure, which was published by Simon & Schuster, my publisher, is just a wonderful book talking about how unfortunate it was, really from the 1960s right through the 1990s, how the evangelical world taught young people that the worst possible thing on earth was to have intercourse before marriage. And so you really are utterly ignorant. You teach yourself everything that you know about sexuality. And somehow I had fashioned this notion that marriage was going to cure me. And as I say at the end of the introduction in the book, the morning after I was married, I was lying there before dawn looking up at the ceiling, and it was just this strong sense, oh no, this did not cure me. And also at that same time, this strong sense of, oh my God, I'm in the wrong body.
And I have worked with partners whose spouses came out to them as gay or transgender. And that's a rough one for the partner, the straight partner. And yet you had, talk about that as much as you're willing to share about Kathy, about falling in love with her, and I think still loving her. As I read your book, it seemed to me there was a lot of love there. So that's not an easy topic, I'm sure, but I think it's essential to who you are and who she is.
Well, she plays a big part in the book because she's played a big part in my life. We were married for 40 years, both came from similar backgrounds. She also was a student at that Christian university. And I was convinced enough that marriage was going to cure me that I had not told her before we married about me. It was after we married, and neither one of us remembers exactly when, somewhere in that first year, that I told her that I was trans, only at that point we didn't have language for it. And so she received it with a lot of grace. And yet we also knew if it was something we talked about to anyone, that I would instantly lose my job, that our livelihood would be in jeopardy. And so unfortunately, I said to her, as I was telling myself, we can't tell anyone this. And it was our secret until we both entered therapy years later. And then one of my friends was also a therapist. And really it was 5 people who knew it until the time that I knew I needed to tell the children, because I was beginning to realize it was possible I was going to need to transition. But Kathy was very supportive of me all the way through it. And as I say at one point in the book, I went on hormones because I was hoping that maybe a low dose of estrogen and anti-androgens might just kind of settle my soul down enough that I could continue to live as a man. And that low dosage did not do that. It did just the opposite. In fact, I remember my physician saying 3 months after I started, she said, oh my, your body's changing like a 13-year-old's would change. You don't see that happen in someone your age. You're going to have to decide soon whether you can remain on these or not, because it's going to become obvious to people. I went home and told Kathy, and she was the one who said to me, you can't go off of them. And I know it was an extremely loving thing for her to do. She was with me through every part of transitioning. And the real difficult day for us was we had an amazing marriage therapist. He was on the south side of Denver. And he retired. His last name was Solomon, which I think was just perfect. And we happened to be his last clients on his last day. And we're both therapists. So I just asked him, I said, Mike, how many couples are willing to work this hard? And he did not hesitate. He said 1%. And I said, how many couples get this far as couples? And he again said, well, 1%. And then he said, that's what makes this so tragic, because you're a lesbian and she's not. And I think for the two of us, that's the point when we realized that it was over. That if she was going to be authentic to herself, she needed to end the marriage and look at the possibility of having a relationship with someone else. And so that was a very painful time for me, because that's not the choice I would have made, but I certainly respected that choice. And we get along wonderfully. She was just here a couple of hours ago. She's here usually one day a week. We have an office here and we still work together in RLT Pathways. And so she was here to see a client, and she was as supportive as she usually is.
Yeah.
Which is to say quite supportive.
There's a quote that I found after I read your book, and I know your spiritual life is vital to you, and also a guide in your relationship with God. And I found this quote that I want to say, because it's probably my favorite Bible verse, and I don't know all that many, but it says from Matthew 16, for those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. But what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Was this a part of the compulsion you had to finally, I call it a compulsion, the urge, the calling, that you must do the transition? What were the influences that finally...
I consider it a calling. And I have never looked at that passage from that perspective. When you grow up evangelical, your first go-to is to look at any passage the way it was explained to you as an evangelical. So there's always a little bit of deconstruction for me to do anytime I look at a passage anew. But as I listen to you say it now, I realize, well, it's exactly what was happening, that I was in fact going to lose my own soul if I did not answer that call. And for me, it came as a call. As I say in the introduction to the book, was it from God? I don't know. I don't know about these things. I know I had never experienced something that strong before. I was watching my favorite television show of all time. It was actually 11 years ago last month, Lost, in the final season. And there came a point at which the protagonist of the story, Jack, if you were a Lost fan, realizes he's been called by God to die. And I just dropped down to the floor and started sobbing, because I realized in that moment I was being called to figuratively die. And I just sobbed until maybe 2 in the morning, and I fell asleep on the couch for a little while and then woke up again at 4 and then sobbed all the way to dawn. I knew I had been called. Interestingly, it was 2 years before I started on hormones, because virtually all of us, I think, called into the hero's journey initially reject that call, because the call into the hero's journey is always a call into the road of trials, and no one willingly goes onto the road of trials. So I did, in fact, push hard against it, but I knew I had been called. Interestingly, I've only had 2 calls since. One was to go back to the church, which for me was Highlands Church in Denver. And then the third was to start Left Hand Church. And in fact, I'm one of the founding pastors of Left Hand and one of the 4 co-pastors who serves the church now. Those would be the only 3 times in my life that I felt strongly called to something.
Yeah. Well, I want to back it up to the story so we get a kind of sequence, because Left Hand Church is part of the joy that followed. And so we have to go through some of the trials. And I think that what you experienced after you moved, you had an epiphany from seeing Lost, and you just described that. But then you had a fateful call when you came out to your boss. And what surprised you about that?
I think I was very naive. And I really thought that because I wasn't sure I was going to transition at that point, it was just a distinct possibility, maybe even a probability. I thought that I would be allowed to remain in my position for at least another 1 year. I certainly wasn't financially prepared to lose it. And by my request was actually that I remain in my current position doing my current work for the next 12 months. And then for 12 months after that, I would begin to disengage in a private way from the organization, but I would still work behind the scenes. And the last thing he said as I left his house in New York was, and of course, I had chosen him to be my successor. He said, "Yeah, we can figure out a way to make this work." And then just a couple of days later, I received a rather terse email from him saying the executive committee wants you to meet at the Denver airport next Wednesday. And I was livid, just livid. First of all, you don't email something like that. You call. And I had suggested a way forward that actually would have been far less traumatic for everyone. Because as it turns out, I was in fact let go on Christmas Eve and was told that I needed to inform all of our board, most of whom were lead pastors of megachurches, on Christmas Eve. That it actually wasn't Christmas Eve, but I was told I was going to be let go. That was, I believe, December 20. But I had to call all these people on Christmas Eve and tell them what was going on, and basically give them a Transgender 101 tutorial in between the Christmas Eve services that they were conducting. It was hell. It was just awful. I did not think I would be discarded like that. And most of those people, well, actually, all of those people, I have never talked to again. None of the board members, none of the senior staff of the organization. There's one staff person that I've been in contact with, but that's it.
Yeah. When I first met you, it was at this low time. When,
yeah, you and PFLAG Boulder County. I mean, I'm a huge fan of PFLAG nationally, and have loved doing workshops at the PFLAG National Convention. But it was PFLAG Boulder County, particularly you and Eleanor, who really just kind of, you saw someone who was in crisis, and you took me under your wing. And you figure rather prominently at that point in the book, because I think you guys were the ones who got me through the absolute toughest time. Yeah, you give me hope.
Yeah. Well, and my heart also went out to Kathy, who was having her own struggle. I do the parallel thing because I think you have a family, and I want you to talk some about having to come out to your family, because it was one thing to lose your job and all of that, but I know family is really critical and of high value to you. So tell us what you want to about that process in sharing with your family.
Yeah, Kathy and I decided together that it was time to tell the kids, and that was in December of 2012. So I'd been on hormones for about 6 months, and that was the point at which she had said, you can't go off of them. And the girls were extremely supportive. And I think, as girls are taught to do in our culture, they did not take care of themselves first and foremost. They took care of me. And so they set aside their own needs to make sure I was okay. And both of them were very, very present to me, really for the next 2.5 years from that point on. Jonathan, being raised as a boy with the confidence of a boy, basically was just angry, and he just kind of disappeared and stayed away for a good long while. It was about 1.5 years before we finally came back together. And of course, since that time, we spoke together at TED Women. We've spoken together at the TED Summit. We've done workshops together, television shows all over the nation, because he wrote a marvelous book, She's My Dad, about his experience. The girls each had to take their leave. I lived in Denver for 1 year, and that kind of was the year that Jana was going through a divorce, my youngest, and she just kind of stepped back for a while. And then JL, it was a little later than that, my middle child, my oldest daughter. After she knew I was fine, she's always been concerned about Kathy and me. She stepped back. She's an administrator in the Denver school system, and she was getting busier and busier at work. And I think she also just kind of needed to pull back. And I just had a big, giant birthday. I turned 50 on May 2nd of this year. And so my family went with me. to Hawaii. So it was so good to be with all of them in Hawaii on my 50th birthday. We're going to go with that. We're just going to stick with that, Jean. We're going to stick with
Okay.
that.
Okay.
And you just recently turned 60, right?
Well, something like that.
Well, yeah, you're kind of a, yeah, actually, it was my 70th birthday, just to be clear.
Well, and I'm going to turn 88. So if that makes you feel young, that's fine with me.
You are my inspiration, Jean. You're the one I want to be just like you when I'm that age.
Well, yeah, be careful what you wish for. I think you're doing fine on your own. I was going to have you read some things, and I've already jumped past where that was appropriate. How do you feel? Do you still feel at home? Or how do you feel about being part of the evangelical world? Because you have started a new church that is...
Well, it is not an evangelical church. It's a post-evangelical church.
Okay.
Evangelicalism, unfortunately, has aligned itself strongly against our community. In fact, if you take a look at the over 100 laws currently pending, 9 that have been passed, taking away the civil rights of transgender adolescents, where do these laws come from? And there was an interesting article, and I think it was the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago, that said 60% of conservatives of all stripes and all ages who voted for Donald Trump are fully supportive of transgender people having the same civil rights everyone else has. So if that's not who's behind these laws, who is? Well, unfortunately, it's evangelicals. 84% of evangelicals believe that gender is immutably determined at birth. 61% believe that it's not okay, the level of civil rights that our country has given to transgender people. And yet only 25% know a transgender person. So our church, like many, like in the Denver area, Denver Community Church or Highlands Church, which actually are 2 of our parent congregations, those churches are all post-evangelical. And what that means is their style is evangelical. So it's the kind of worship experience that you would see in a mega church. They are independent congregations, so their leadership is evangelical, but their theology is not. Their theology would be much more like mainline Protestantism, like the Methodist Church that you're a part of.
Well,
and that's what Left Hand is. Left Hand is a post-evangelical church where we like to say we're distinctly Christian, for sure, but we also think it's an important place for all of us to work out what it means to be human together and to figure out what man's search for meaning is all about. We think it's better to do that in community. So that's what drives our church.
Yeah, that's good. If you were going to give a message or try to be an influence on some of the legislation that is happening around the country about not allowing for young people to have hormone treatment, not allowing trans girls to play sports, that sort of thing, let alone the bathroom thing, which, that's a whole other story. But they seem to be hot button issues for some people. And I think it's all based on fear. What do you think? And what would you say?
Oh, my goodness. It's absolutely, completely, utterly based on fear. I just had an op-ed published on the CNN.com site a couple of hours ago that will be up there for a while. And it says quite clearly how I feel about what's happening in these various states. Unfortunately, the fundamentalist forms of all 3 desert religions are still religions of scarcity. I mean, all 3 desert religions, by the definition, began as religions of scarcity: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. They began in the desert. I don't have to go around, got to take care of my own. And in their more generous expressions, none of them are still to this day religions of scarcity, but in their fundamentalist forms, all 3 are. And in the United States, it's fundamentalist Christianity that has the greatest influence right now on legislative bodies in at least 28 states of the United States. And those groups very much have created enemies that don't exist. They've created 2 of them, a woman's right to choose and the LGBTQ plus community. Both, by the way, social issues that in holding those issues, it costs their exclusively male leadership absolutely nothing. They don't have to give up anything to hold those 2 positions.
Yeah, no, well, it's very timely that your book is being published at this time, I think, because you'd hope that people would would read it and learn and open their hearts to their humanity.
I hope so, Jean, because I'm convinced, and I think this is one of the things that makes PFLAG really set aside among the various wonderful organizations that exist, is PFLAG is about stories. It's about each family's story. It's about parents telling the stories of their children coming out. And I believe that that's the only way that we narrow the divide that exists in this nation, is by hearing one another's stories. We don't get anywhere yelling across the street at each other. If we can sit on the front porch together and tell and listen to stories, I think we can bring about healing. And that's what I hope this book is. What I'm afraid will happen is that evangelicals will not read it. You know, that's my fear. But I hope it's written in a way that will entice some into the story. I think my memoir is relevant to everyone because it's ultimately about living authentically. And I think we're all called to live authentically. And I think in the telling of that story, the specifics of it, I believe, can be healing to people who are coming from the other side of the divide. For that 75% of evangelicals, for instance, who've never met a transgender person.
If we had more time, and I know that they're going to stop us soon for Q&A, but you've done some TED Talks about what you've learned in living in both genders. And you've been, as you admit freely, very privileged and entitled in your early life. And
I still am.
And you still are. Okay, talk about that some and what you discovered until we get cut off for the Q&A time.
Yeah, I think Michaela just told us that this is the last question before we go to Q&A.
Okay.
So I brought my privilege with me when I transitioned, and I had no idea just how privileged I was. And there's so many times that I still don't think I know how privileged I am. I remember one time I was talking about my implicit bias with one of her other co-pastors, Christy Sykes. And she said, "Oh, well, I'm glad you're becoming aware of that." And she was so kind and gracious in saying that, because what I wanted to say was, "Oh, how bad is it? And how long have you known?" I did not want to know the answer to that.
Yeah.
Because I did, I think, bring a lot of my entitlement, my privilege with me. I did not have decade upon decade of enculturation as a woman. And yet, even at that, I look at the confidence I've lost in just 7 years. It's like, God, it's a wonder a woman can have the confidence to do anything. Because I find myself now all the time apologizing for myself, saying to people, when I'm right, I'm sorry. You know, in my first TED Talk, I said, you don't have to apologize for being right. And yet I do it all the time now. So I do see that sense of entitlement diminishing. But yeah, it was very much a part of my life. I had no idea how privileged I was as a white man, or how much closer to the finish line I started life. And I think most guys are that way, particularly white guys who've had an opportunity to get a great education and have a good career. They know they've worked hard. I certainly worked hard, but they are clueless to the fact that they began far closer to the finish line than anyone else, including every female in their lives.
Yeah, well, good place for us to transition then, as to use a phrase, where we might have some questions. Take it over.
Truly, Jean, Paula, we could listen to you talk for much longer. I know we've got some eager questions here in the chat, but people have been so supportive throughout the whole time as well. So thank you both for that beginning part of this event, the main part of this event. So I wanted to...
Now, Michaela, I'm going to stop you just for a second. And I'm going to say, before you ask the questions, we all need to see what's on the bottom of your sweatshirt. Feminism is the radical
It's called Feminism is the Radical Notion That Women Are People.
I love it. Thank you for showing us all of it. We've all been wondering the whole time.
I wore it on purpose because it is, I think, essential and vital for this particular event. So thank you for allowing me the privilege to show it off. I appreciate that, Paula. Like I said, I want to turn it over to Q&A. So if you have any eager questions for Paula and Jean or Jean, please put them in the chat below. One is a really great one, Paula. After so many TED Talks, what led you to write a book, and why did you feel a book was the next best step for your story?
I've been becoming more and more alarmed at the polarization taking place in the United States. And TED Talks generally appeal to a particular segment of the population. And honestly, it's not a segment that voted for Donald Trump for the most part. And all you have to do is look at the comments of my first TEDx Mile High Talk, which is on YouTube. And I think there's 16, 17,000 of them there. I do not look at them because some of those people can say some pretty nasty things. So I thought, what is a way to take it to the next level? How can we, in fact, bring about greater change? And I realized it's through story. I mean, our need for narrative is biological. I say in our church all the time that we don't sleep without dreaming, and we don't dream in mathematical equations. We dream in stories. Although I wonder if your husband, Jack, might have dreamed in mathematical equations, Jean, back in the day.
I don't think so.
He was a mathematics professor at CU Boulder. But we dream in stories. And I think it's the stories that need to be heard and need to be told. And so in the case of my memoir, there are 2 chapters on gender inequity. There are 2 chapters on how evangelicalism behaves in American culture. But the lion's share of the book, the first 15 chapters and the final chapter, are purely my story. And I thought that that was the best way for us to maybe open a dialogue with a segment of the population that might not ever meet me, but might, in the secrecy of their own home, read my story, particularly the thousands of evangelicals I knew in my previous life. At some point or another, I preached in 3 of the 10 largest churches of the United States. I've preached in the 2nd and 3rd largest churches in Boulder County. And none of those people are in my life any longer, but I do think a lot of them will read this book.
Another great question here has to do with research and resources. What resources helped you in your journey into womanhood? And then also, what do you recommend for young people exploring their own gender identity? Other than your book,
I think
exploring their gender identity as a woman.
It's not I think my book isn't the first place I would send them. I think pflag.org is a marvelous place to go, and the resources there. The Human Rights Campaign is, in fact, a wonderful place to go. Their focus in that area has really caught up a ton of the last few years. The Trevor Project, another good place. If people are coming out of an evangelical background, the Q Christian Fellowship is an excellent resource, qcf.org. I'm actually on their board and have done a lot of work with them. Those are all places to start. For parents of children who identify as transgender, TIES, and do you know what the TIES website is, Jean? Does that jump out at you right offhand?
I don't know exactly. I imagine it's something like tyes.org. Might be .com, actually.
Yeah, it might be. It is, but if you look at TYES Colorado, yes, fortunately, there are a lot of good resources here.
Yes, it is tyes-colorado.org.
Thank you.
Anytime. Jean, I want to ask the question of you as well, given your history of working with so many members of the LGBTQ IA plus community, specifically trans youth. Are there any resources you want to add to Paula's list?
I was just trying to remember. What I have done is kind of retire from my activism in PFLAG. So I used to have those at the tip of my fingers, and I don't. Now and Paula, maybe you can help me. There's a online group that is extremely helpful. It is nationally known, and I'm not coming up with a name for it. It has to do with gender, gender something. Does it, you know what I would just recommend to people that they
Yeah.
Google family support for, yeah. And I feel bad. If I'd known I was going to be asked that, I would have looked it up. But there are resources that we didn't have 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the things that's quite wonderful about it. The saddest stories that I know are from people who came out much, much earlier, when people in general, I mean, the public in general didn't even know the word transgender, and maybe they didn't even have a word for it. And they got, well, it's extremely sad. And they weren't as entitled as Paula, and they lost everything.
Absolutely.
And so the suicide rate, I mean, you should just know this. And Paula, I'm sure you know the exact number. I'm not good at, my husband was good at numbers, but I'm not. But the suicide rate for transgender persons is much higher than for any other population that I know.
Suicide attempt rate is 40% for transgender people. Suicide attempt rate for transgender teens, if their parents are not supportive of them, is 13 times higher than their peers. It is one of the most at-risk groups in the United States for suicide, which is really a tragedy. Fortunately, when it comes to trans kids and teens, Anschutz, the Children's Hospital, they really have done amazing work. And I was able to speak to their physicians a couple of years ago. And I just was so impressed with the work they've been doing in this area. They're a wonderful resource. We're fortunate here on the Front Range that it's an area that is pretty warm to us for the most part, to the trans community. And also there are more resources here than one might think. You can go to a lot of other major cities on the coasts that don't have the kinds of resources that are available here in the greater Denver area. The Springs, little different story, not so much down there for obvious reasons.
Right, but we're still very grateful for the resources and for those that provide them. I do want to give a quick shout out to Toby Cahill in the chat, who posted links that we were talking about.
Good. Toby would know.
I knew Toby would have those, and I knew Toby also would likely post them. Yeah, so, Toby's going to be moderating one of my other conversations this month. Yeah.
Well, we can look forward to that as well. Our last question here is actually for both of you. It's something that we like to ask here. Oh, here comes Joanna.
Hi. Just want to thank you for such a great event.
Oh, good. We're still live here. And so we're just going to finish up our last questions. Joanna is actually a publicist, Paula's publicist here.
Hi, everyone.
And Joanna's been wonderful to work with. Oh, my goodness. It has been a delight to work with Simon & Schuster. My editor, Michelle, was just terrific, and Joanna and her whole team have been like amazing.
Yes, absolutely. I want to ask our last question here. And Joanna, if you want to pipe in too, you're more than welcome to. But it is for you, Jean, as a reader, and for you, Paula, as a writer. But what did this book, as a woman, teach you? And I love to start with Jean's answer and then end with our author of the hour, Paula Stone Williams. What
did it teach me? I've been on this journey for a while, just as an ally and as a cisgender woman. I guess it's a conversation I want to have privately with Paula about how growing up as a woman and becoming a woman are really two different stories and two different awarenesses. And I think that's a rich conversation to have, because I'm thinking of my own upbringing. And of course, I grew up in another generation too, about, where any kind of sexual minority or gender minority was not even in the vocabulary or in the awareness or anything. So there've been those kind of changes that I have experienced. And so having read the book, I just found that it was, for one thing, very well written. I think that there's a poet in Paula that expresses itself in words and expressions and all that resonates with me. So I found it touching. And I knew, even though I knew some of the story, I felt the pain all over again for me. it's something that isn't unique to Paula. I think it's anybody that I know who's gone through this process it's not easy. It's a very brave thing to do, and it is life-saving, and it is soul-saving. And I understand that at a level of empathy that I can't experience, but I really appreciate.
Thank you.
I think for me, I would say, first of all, thank you, Jean, for saying the kind things about the book. I experienced the same thing with Michelle, my editor, that I experienced with Briar Goldberg, who is the head coach for TED and has coached me in all of my TED Talks, which is frequently hearing, not quite there yet, not quite there yet, not quite there yet. I have a tendency to want to tell, not show, and to not always want to be transparent. And what I learned in this is that transparency is hard, that it is not easy to just put yourself out there as honestly as you're capable of doing. I don't know that any of us don't always carry some baggage with us in anything we write or say, but trying as hard as I could to get the facts right, the details right, and to not be afraid of the things about myself that were difficult. And it was painful. It was very painful writing this book, and it's been painful this week talking about it. I was interviewed this morning by Wisconsin Public Radio, and she asked a wonderful question at the end that just left me in tears. But I would rather live this way. I would rather live authentically because, like I say in the dedication of the book, to all who believe the call toward authenticity is sacred and holy and for the greater good, this book was written.
It was beautiful. Thank you both for your candor. Thank you for your kindness and your generosity with your stories. Paula, especially you with what you've given us in this book. As a Woman is available now at tattercover.com and at any of our locations. So I would highly recommend that you get your copy if you haven't already. For those of you who ordered the book with us through this event, we're mailing those out tomorrow morning for you, so you can read them as soon as you can. We thank you all again for joining us. Paula and Jean, I want to each give you a moment to remind people who you are, where they can find you online, and anything else you want to say before we close out. And Jean, I'm going to ask you to start again, and we'll end with.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not a famous person anymore, or if I ever was, but and I don't even belong to LinkedIn. So if people want to reach me, they can reach me and I'll share my email because I am unafraid of that. And I love conversations that are meaningful. It's Jean, Jean, BLDR @comcast.net. So I'm a PFLAG mom. I have a gay son. I have been an ally since 1993. And before that, I was probably an ignorant ally. I didn't know what I know now, but I've always cared about social justice. So that's my thing.
Thank you. And Paula?
And for me, you can find me at paulastonewilliams.com. I have a blog there that is pretty much write every week for. I didn't always write every week while I was writing the book because that was hard, but that's the best place to find me. Or at Left Hand Church. We meet online as well as live every Sunday at 5, and people can just go to Left Hand Church and find us. Just Google that. We're the only Left Hand Church around, and yeah, they can find me at either place.
And we're Tattered Cover Bookstore in Denver, Colorado. And we want to say thank you all again for shopping locally. For some of you, it's dinner time out there. We recommend supporting a local business, maybe a mom and pop shop you can order from or go out and visit. We thank you all again for joining us. This has been celebrating the release of As a Woman by Paula Stone Williams. And we thank you all again. You can get your copies at tatteredcover.com. If you'll stick around, all of you here, while I close this out. Thank you again for joining us. Check out our upcoming events at tatteredcover.com/event. Stay safe, everybody. Happy reading. Good night, all.